Hey, everybody. If you didn't hear, I think probably the words got around. The sandwiches are late. They're coming now, and so they'll be served when we're done. So when you're leaving, you can grab yourself a sandwich. Sorry about that. So welcome everyone to BIOMES. I think everyone probably knows at this point, this is our flagship noon seminar. And I just wanted to start by recognizing the folks that get this going. It is, I was going to say, you know, it's a lot of hard work, but I'm going to say it's a lot of fun because we're always looking for volunteers. We meet a lot to pull this off. And so I'd just like to thank Melanie and Lori, our sort of fearless leaders on this, and then the student committee who include Gabe and Brandon as co-leads, and then Phoebe, Hannah, Rob, Ann, Kair, Anastasia, and Samantha, who help out. It's really fun. It's really fun to think about, you know, different directions that we can take this every semester. So feel free to hop on and join us if you have interest. But today we're here for Nancy Grimm. Nancy is she's hard to summarize, but I'm gonna do my best. She's a professor of ecology, Regents professor, special assistant to the director of DEI, and special assistant for faculty and mentoring and development at ASU. So that's at least 3 different hats. She's done foundational work in stream ecology, which is how I was originally found out and read about Nancy. And I'm excited that that's what we're gonna hear about today. But she's also sort of like a founding voice on the topic of urban biogeochemistry. And over the past 2 decades, has sort of really, you know, set the stage and helped develop this idea of urban ecology. And some of you might know her through that work. She's also a leading figure in thinking about global change and sustainability. So she's truly an impressive scholar, but also a great colleague, very collaborative scientist. And this work on this broad range of topics that she's excelled at has earned her membership in the National Academy of Sciences. She also received the Redfield Lifetime Achievement Award from ASLO. If you don't know, ASLO is well, it's not the American Society anymore, the Association of Limnology and Oceanography. And if you don't know, Redfield was a famous oceanographer, sort of set the stage for stoichiometry. And she also has the Sustainability Science Award from the Ecological Society of America. So she's here visiting us for this whole semester as the Coleman Burke Distinguished Lecturer in Climate Science. Her office is on the first floor here. I really encourage you to engage Nancy while she's here. But I would also like to encourage you to give her a warm welcome for today's seminar.
Thanks. I don't think I've given a strictly stream ecology talk in a really long time. So bear with me because I'm going to talk about some old stuff and some new stuff. But I'm really delighted to be here, and I need to turn on the microphone, don't I? Okay. I'm really delighted to be here at Yale for this semester. I have been, a couple weeks ago, I gave a closing keynote at the Hickson conference, and then there's this seminar today. So I've been busy getting those ready, and now that this, or as soon as this one is over, I'll be much more available. My door will be open. Please come visit me, talk about whatever you like to. So I'm going to talk today about disturbance in stream ecosystems, and specifically a stream that I've been studying for a very long time. And at the end of this talk, I will talk about our new entry in the disturbance regime, which is fire. So I want to begin by acknowledging, I can change. Why is that not working? This is not working. Yes, it is now. Okay. I want to begin by acknowledging the people who have cared for the land that I work on in Arizona for centuries. And in particular, I just learned as I got interested in sort of indigenous science and indigenous perspectives that Sycamore Creek, that I've been studying for over 40 years, flows through the homelands of the Acoma-Atham, the Pipash, the Yavpe, and the Nende tribes of Arizona, among the 22 federally recognized tribes in Arizona. And so I wanted to begin by acknowledging those people. I'm going to talk today about disturbance, as I said. I've been interested in disturbance for a long time, as this diagram depicts. I want to thank my former students and postdocs for really summarizing and organizing the story of my career for me in this paper that they wrote for the Journal of Hydrology last year. And in it was this analysis of the keywords in many of my papers over the years. And there's an interesting timeline here that goes from 2000 to 2020. I did publish before 2000, but mostly looking at those papers. And what you can see is there's terms up here that have to do with disturbance, like flood and drying and disturbance itself, and there's resilience. And then you get these things here that are kind of in a group that are more reflective of the urban work that I've been doing on disturbance and resilience as well. Anyway, as I said, I've been interested in it for a long time, and I think stream ecologists also have been studying disturbance and talking about disturbance for a very long time. And let's just start by being really simple about what disturbance is. It is a change in the minimal structure caused by a factor external to the level of interest, from Pickett et al. 1989. So a change in system structure, it can be a discrete event, or it can be prolonged or short, but it's discrete. It has a beginning and an end. It can be internal or external. It can be a component of a regime. And when I say that, I mean a regime is sort of the sum total of disturbances over time in a system. And we're concerned about the type of a disturbance, the mechanism of its impact and response. And I put this in just a little nod to some of the urban work that we've been doing. We were interested in understanding how different disciplines treated the idea of extreme events. And so we looked at those literatures from these 6 different disciplines: climatology, earth sciences, hydrology, ecology, engineering, and social science. Interestingly, in the top 10 words used by those disciplines to describe extreme events, ecology is the only one that uses the word disturbance. So it really is an ecological thing. And I think one of the more recent conceptual frameworks for ecological disturbance that I like is one that was published by Peters et al. In 2011. And, you know, it just is trying to unpack the elements of ecological disturbance. So a disturbance event occurs when drivers like storms or El Nino Southern Oscillation or various things like that produce a certain type of disturbance that could be drying, flooding, pest outbreaks, etc. Then there are disturbance mechanisms, which are the actual things that operate on the system. So it could be things like wind throw or scour or stranding, combustion and oxidation of organic matter. But what's important, or what they really were trying to emphasize here, is that we have to understand the system properties. What is basically the system that is being disturbed? So not just what are the disturbances, but what kinds of components of the system are being disturbed. What is the model of the system, essentially? Only then can we look at the changes in system properties brought about by those disturbance mechanisms that define the impact. And then we have a period of sort of reorganization, recovery, succession, whatever you want to call it, where various drivers, internal processes and external drivers, influence the rate of change following that disturbance. arriving at a new system state that then is subject to disturbance as well. And just threw this in because I think it's kind of interesting to think about. This is how we, I was very lucky to actually work with Stuart Pickett on this project. We had been talking since both of us started doing urban ecology about weather ecological disturbance, which of course he is one of the founders of the theory of ecological disturbance with his book, Pickett and White book. We wanted to ask whether it could be applied in urban systems. And I think the important point that I wanted to make here is that in urban systems, we might have to add some different kinds of drivers. They might be social drivers, they might be technological drivers, and we have to add some different kinds of internal processes, again, social, ecological, or technological, or a combination of those things. But you can use this framework to really think about disturbance in urban systems. That's all I'm going to say about urban systems, sorry. Okay, and then sort of the flip side, what is resilience? And I'm not going to define it here. There are lots of definitions out in the literature. I'll define it a little later according to what I did as a graduate student or a postdoc. But all of these phrases that you see here encapsulate all of the different views out there about what resilience is. And this concept in the literature and in practice is complicated and contested. So it's not only whether it's one of these different things, but whether even resilience is a property of systems, whether it's a process, whether it's an outcome. And as Steve Carpenter asked in 2001, we need to understand what resilience of what, to what, and for whom. So that's my quick introduction to disturbance and resilience. And now I want to get into considering desert stream ecosystems. These ecosystems are highly productive. They can be algae or wetland plant dominated systems. And you can see that there's wide variation in plant abundance or biomass. Seasonal increases in primary producer biomass usually follow winter rains or spring floods. And these systems are super captivating because they are so dynamic. Here you can see that's two photos from the same spot. Flash flooding can turn a trickle of water into a roaring river in seconds with orders of magnitude, sometimes up to 4 orders of magnitude increase in discharge. And drying, where segments of the stream completely lose surface flow. And just to illustrate one of the impacts of flooding, this is Mike Bogan. He's a 6-foot man standing next to a debris pile that was brought up against this tree during one of these large events in Sycamore Creek. So why are these disturbances so important here? Well, this is a system and an area, a region of the United States where there's tremendous hydrologic variability from one year to the next. So on the top right, you see a graph of average monthly precipitation. And it is true that precipitation occurs in this region of the Sonoran Desert 2 times a year. There's a winter rainy season, and then there's a summer monsoon, which is associated with a shift in wind direction. We also have a predictable summer dry period, which occurs between April 15th and June 15th, when we've never actually seen any flooding in Sycamore Creek. So that's pretty interesting over a 60-year period or so. But really, there's no typical year. So there's a lot of variation, and it's not really shown in that graph of precipitation. Because precipitation being translated to discharge, of course, is not, it's not a one-to-one proposition. So on the bottom left, you can see that the discharge, the flow in the stream, is highly correlated with particularly winter precipitation, this period between December and March. And that winter precipitation is strongly associated with the El Nino Southern Oscillation. So we get wet years that have a lot of winter precipitation and higher flow. and dry years that have lower flow. So the hydrographs that you see on the bottom right are 3 different types of years. So the green is what we might call a normal year, sort of in the middle of the range. The blue is a wet year, and the red is a dry year. And you can barely see a few little events occurring in that dry year of 2012 in the summer monsoon. I'm going to refer to wet years and dry years throughout. The discharge range that you see here is really quite high. So we can't see the low flows, but they are there are low flows that occur during the summer period. So we're just seeing the big events here. Okay, so in turning back to disturbance and resistance and resilience, in this study that we published in 1989, we were able to directly measure disturbance and recovery. So I define them here as resistance to deflection of state variables across a disturbance, and resilience as the rate of recovery after the disturbance, arguing that those are measurable features of stability which have been used to characterize ecosystem or community response to disturbance. I do want to point out that at the time I was being educated by my friend and colleague Steve Carpenter that in fact we should not be using these sort of terms about recovery or return to pre-disturbance states, because ecosystems aren't equilibrium systems. They're constantly changing. So that whole world has gone on, but I still want to argue that we are able to measure these characteristics, whatever we want to call them, and I think they are associated with resilience. So just a quick summary of what we found in that paper. We were looking at 35 different events. For several of those, we were able to look at the change in biotic components across those disturbances. So all ecosystem biotic components declined across floods, and resistance decreased with flood magnitude or maximum peak flow. So many of the events that you see, like 18 of the events, are very low flows, and those there was some resistance to those very low flows, but for some taxa, some components of the system, cyanobacteria and filamentous green algae in particular, they really couldn't survive much of a bigger flood than that. Diatoms, sort of attached algae, and macroinvertebrates were more resistant to floods. And then we also can look at resilience as the recovery or successional periods following floods. They vary in length. We see that there is a sequential algal patch succession, if you will, and I'll show you a picture of that. Longer sequences, these ones that are out over 100 days or so, tend to extend in the summer, and so the ecosystem is exposed to drying disturbance, and those longer sequences often lead to greater nitrogen limitation in the system. So within a year, several events may occur then that result in an abrupt elimination of biota and initiate a period of reorganization, recovery, succession, or change. So here you can see the rapid growth of algal biomass here, measured as chlorophyll A, and a somewhat lagged increase in macroinvertebrate densities, numbers of individuals over time. And here's that one of the kinds of sequences that we often see where bare sediment gives way to epilithic diatoms, which you see here, this brown color on the sediment, gives way to filamentous green algae that you see here. And then in some sequences, very long sequences, we get cyanobacteria coming in, which are nitrogen fixers. So it does, I think, appear that we can quantify resilience or recovery in these systems by measuring these kinds of rates of increase. Another interesting and longstanding project that we've worked on is to understand how linkages between different subsystems in this ecosystem affect rates of recovery. And this is just a encapsulation of some of that. So the system has some three-dimensionality. So the water does move through subsurface and in gravel bars and so forth. And when that water comes out of a gravel bar, you often get a very high abundance of algae at that site. And we can see that the rate of post-flooding change is much higher in those areas of upwelling where water's coming up from the surface than in areas of downwelling. And the mechanism is a delivery of the limiting nutrient, nitrogen, from one system to the other. So the connectivity between systems is enhancing resilience for this ecosystem. Okay, so on the opposite end of the hydrologic spectrum is drying as a disturbance. And drying became of interest to us when Emily Stanley, now at the University of Wisconsin, joined the group. And I just want to point out here, this is one measure of drying disturbance. This is the number of zero flow days in the system. And you can see there's a long period between 1970 and about 1970 and about 1988 when there are no zero flow days. So it's a very wet period. Emily arrived around here when it started to get dry, and I started working here when it was really wet. So your conception of what a system looks like in this highly variable kind of environment might not really serve over the long term. In any case, Emily looked at changes in surface water abundance, the effects of drying on algae, on invertebrates, on various other components of the ecosystem, including ecosystem processes. Many papers came out of that work. And I have to note also for anyone that's interested in stream ecology that this intermittent streams and ephemeral streams is a really hot topic today in stream ecology. So what happens when drying and drought occur? Well, this is just some data from a paper that was published by Ryan Sponseller and others. And we were looking at a long-term record of macroinvertebrate communities. These are non-metric multidimensional scaling axes that sort of reflect the community structure of the macroinvertebrate community. And you can see along this axis one, a clear distinction between the dry phase, which are these dark circles, and the wet phase, which are these light circles here. You can also see that in late succession that you lose richness, that there's a divergence between these two types of sequences, the wet phase and dry phase, in late succession. So this is there's evidence that there is some sensitivity of some of the macroinvertebrate taxa to drying more than there is to flooding. Okay, so these are one-off kind of telling you what the system is, how it's responding to floods and drying. And drying, I would point out, is one of these discrete but protracted disturbances. It has a beginning and it has an end, but it can happen over a long period of time. But when we start thinking about the interaction of the disturbances, we have to look at longer temporal scales. So if we start to think about hydrologic variability over multiple years, this is a plot of all of the normalized discharge by day of year in Sycamore Creek. And this red line is a Fourier transform. It tells you kind of what you would expect as the typical discharge pattern for a year. But look at the variation here. In the winter, tremendous variation from nothing to very high flows. And even in the summer, which only has a small blip here, you can see that there are some very high flows there as well. So there are two stories I just want to mention about this hydrologic variability and the interaction of flooding and drying. First one is nutrient limitation and nitrogen to phosphorus ratios that vary tremendously among years. And the second one is a story about wetland plant abundance along the 12-kilometer reach of the stream. So this is the nitrogen limitation story. This is not yet published. I'm still working. One of my former students is still working on it. But here you see the ratio of nitrogen to phosphorus, the atomic ratio, which is an indicator of which nutrient is potentially limiting to biological processes. This level here separates potential nitrogen limitation or phosphorus limitation from potential nitrogen limitation. These size of this bar shows you the amount of nitrate, the nitrate concentration, and then the seasons are here. And so basically what you can take away from this is that the growing season period tends to have much lower N to P ratios and be potentially more nitrogen limited. However, we did these analyses of nitrogen limitation and phosphorus limitation using nutrient enrichment bioassays. And what we actually find is that there is some evidence of secondary phosphorus limitation during 2 of these years, which tend to be drier years. So the interaction between disturbance, between flooding and drying is an important one there. The system is also super dynamic over multiple years or decadal timescales. So what you see here is on the top is the same site across these 3 photographs. This has about 50 centimeters or so average depth of sediment, fine sediment. Here, the fine sediment is gone. It's just removed by a flood. And here we have regrowth of vegetation at that same site. So lots of dynamics associated with the distribution of flooding and drying in the system. In the 2000s, when the Forest Service decided to remove cattle grazing from the system, we saw the development of these wetlands. So in the period of time, primarily between 2009 and 2021, we mounted surveys of 12 kilometers of the stream to determine the distribution of wetland vegetation at the same time of year, June 15th each year. I also include some older pictures from an analysis of spatial variation in nitrate concentration along the stream in those years. So the spatial variation in vegetation, here's just some examples. You can see the dots are the amount of vegetation there. In 2009 to 2013, here we see the distribution of vegetation, and it seems that water permanence, that is places where groundwater is entering the stream, is a really important predictor of the distribution of vegetation, but also the distribution of increases in nitrate. As I alluded to earlier, at the sort of reach scale, we see this at the 12-kilometer scale, where places where water is coming up, these red dots, are places where nitrate concentration increases. However, we also have recently uncovered the effects of internal feedbacks, besides this hydrogeomorphic template, internal feedbacks of vegetation, for example, controlling sedimentation, rates of flow through the hyporheic zone or the subsurface zone, and so forth on nitrogen in late succession. And then finally, this more recent period of 2016 to 2020 or so has been extremely dry, and my student, Marina Locke, has documented a local extirpation of one of the wetland species that we were monitoring. So we can ask the question of what drives this spatiotemporal pattern of wetland vegetation across different disturbances, across different wet and dry years. And we argue that there are two primary processes that are responsible for the spatial distribution of vegetation. One is this hydrogeomorphic template, the water permanence. A second one is these local feedbacks that exist and can reinforce the kinds of conditions that are beneficial for wetland plants to exist. So if you look, this is now for the entire or almost the entire data set from 2009 to 2017. This was work led by Xiaoli Dong, now at University of California, Davis. What you can see is that if we look at wetland cover as a function of the cumulative mean daily discharge in flood days, so that's how wet the system is, you can see that there's a lot of variation in cover and across this range of wet to dry years. And yet the variation within years that are the same degree of wetness is tremendous as well. So something else is responsible for that. And so Xiaoli developed this lattice simulation model that looks at local feedbacks as well as the template. So local feedbacks have something to do with the plant and seedling establishment in the system, which they are able to model. The template effect is really an effect that's due to water permanence. And then the local facilitation is this interaction of vegetation with vegetation in subsequent years. And the important thing here is that what we find is that the template effect is strongest during wet years, whereas the local facilitation is strongest during dry years. So when the system is much drier, you have much more important local effects that can be up to 12 times the strength of the template effects. What that means is that under conditions that are expected in the Southwest, where the system becomes drier, hotter, we would expect to see a greater importance of these kinds of local feedback effects. So in terms of this interannual variability and the distribution of floods and drought, both flooding and drying change the minimal structure of the system and therefore our disturbances. Internal processes, system hydrogeomorphic properties, and external drivers determine recovery following disturbances, but they also drive spatial patterns in nitrogen concentration and vegetation along the stream. So, and then the final conclusion from both the work on the vegetation distribution as well as the macroinvertebrates is that drought imparts very strong legacy effects on this ecosystem. So now I want to move to considering the impacts of climate variability and change in this system. And this is from a recent paper that was led by my academic granddaughter, actually, Juna Wang, who is a graduate student of Xiaoli Dong, who was my graduate student. But what Juna has done is to look at the macroinvertebrate and algal data sets from the long-term record from this historical period, 1986 to approximately 2000 or 1999 actually, and then this more recent period, 2010 to 2019. I should point out that those correspond to NSF grants for long-term research in environmental biology. So some of the things that are, when some data are missing, is because we were not funded those years. But what you can see here is, yes, there's still this extreme hydrologic variability, and that's shown in the second one where you see variation in the number of dry days in the gray bars, but also the flood discharge, the discharge in the flood season, which is the size of the blue dots. You can see that's getting smaller compared to here. You can see that air temperature has increased about 1 degree, which is what was projected for this region. And then this is really interesting here. This is actually what do you call it? Sorry, just lost my wavelet power spectrum here. So what this tells you is the wavelet power levels go from 0 up to about 8, and the blue are drier conditions, the red are wetter conditions. And the way you want to read this is that the periods are here. So we go from here's about 1 year here, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years or so. And so what we see is in this longer, here we see this big area of much drier conditions, but we also see the disappearance in the 1 to 3 year range of the wetter conditions. So that corresponds to 2 to 3 year drought periods where you don't have any interruption of that drought. And in fact, if you start looking at these violin plots, you can see differences in annual precipitation and differences in the number of zero flow days from March to July, which is the time period that we're looking at these invertebrate systems. So this increasing 2 to 3 year drought leads to more intermittency in the system, more zero flow days, and that can actually change dramatically the thermal dynamics or thermal conditions in those segments of the stream, because when the stream is flowing, it has this evaporative cooling effect. The temperature doesn't generally get above about 25 degrees C, but when the water becomes stagnant, it can get up over 30 degrees C. So you have this introduction of these sort of novel thermal niches in the system. I should also point out that this is the period of time when plants increased in the system as well. So looking at those two periods now, we can see these, this is a sort of typical pattern that we expected for increases in primary producer biomass, but we see a lot of variation, a lot of stochasticity associated with the more recent period. We see also a shift in community structure over here with a lot more of these wetland plants, as I pointed out, but also the disappearance of a lot of diatoms and filamentous algae that were the dominant primary producers in the historic period. These plots are also interesting, and we'll see this in the next one as well, in that the size of the dot is the discharge of the flood season, and the color reflects the number of zero flow days, with the red being more dry conditions. Oops. So this is the impacts on invertebrates, which is really quite interesting. What we see is, again, a shift from the wet to the dry years here, and a shift in community structure. This is all outlined according to the different types of macroinvertebrates. This is corresponding to a change in richness in the system between the historic period and the current period. And so in this sort of structural model or causal network analysis here, you can see that the impact of winter floods and summer drought directly on algae and macroinvertebrates is replaced by a much stronger impact, direct impact of air temperature on invertebrates and algae, and a very strong impact of summer drought on macroinvertebrates. So this is where the system is heading, because temperatures continue to increase, and whether we have greater amounts or lesser amounts of precipitation in the Southwest, so much of the rainfall is lost to evaporation. In this watershed, it's about, on average, about 92% of the rainfall is lost to evaporation. So we can expect, as temperatures go up, that we're going to see more and more of the conditions that we see here. So a complete disruption of the community structure and biotic interactions of those invertebrate communities. Okay, so finally, I'm getting to the fire part, and this is all really new work. So I want to acknowledge a group for some of this work that I've talked about here, as well as this work on fire. We formed a collaborative for research in arid stream systems. It's mostly a bunch of early career faculty, postdocs, and graduate students who are interested in arid stream systems, I said, I have data. Let's get together and analyze the data and do some work on that. So this group in particular that was formed to start looking at biogeochemistry got interested in looking at the impacts of fire. And so I want to present some conceptual framework that was developed by this team of people, and then some preliminary data from a project that I got funded through the RAPID program at NSF. So wildfires are linked to climate change, and they are on the rise in the Western United States. Wildfires are affecting about 400 more kilometers of stream and river length in the Western US each year. And this is from a paper by Ball et al. Showing the increase in the effect on streams of wildfires. So the attention that what we're interested in here is how wildfire impacts are felt in the stream, and we're primarily looking at this from the standpoint of biogeochemistry. And the project that we're doing involves some data syntheses, synoptic, spatially extensive data, long-term data on larger rivers, and then some long-term data on small streams that primarily are work that John Mielak and his group have done along the Santa Barbara coast, and then work in the Valles Caldera in New Mexico. And I'm not going to talk about that work because it's just underway. We're still working on it, and I'm not really leading it. But here's our conceptual framework that I want to talk through a little bit. We are developing this conceptual framework to think about how fire impacts are likely to be different in arid land systems than they are in more mesic systems, which are pretty well studied. So we identify 4 major processes. The first is combustion. The second is, actually, I'm going to say the first is accumulation. I'll go with that first. Then combustion, transport, and propagation. And I'll go through each of those. And so we're thinking about these, particularly how these 4 kinds of processes or suites of processes are going to be different in arid lands than they are in non-arid systems. So the first is accumulation, and really this is just basically how do you build the pools of organic matter, biomass, nutrients, so forth in a system through various ecosystem processes like primary production or nitrogen fixation, or various other things that can result in an increase in decomposition into carbon pools and various things like that that can result in accumulation of various element pools in the uplands. And I wanted to point out that since we're thinking about arid lands, we're thinking about a big chunk of the Western United States. These are the 5 North American deserts, but we also are looking at chaparral, primarily in California. There's some in Arizona as well, and then dry montane forests. So really along the aridity gradient, less than 500 millimeters per year of annual precipitation, and aridity index of about 0.65 or less. And a lot of them are quite a bit less. So accumulation is driven by water availability in arid lands. And so all of these things I've been talking about, like variation in precipitation and discharge and so forth on seasonal scales, interannual scales, and decadal scales are important to accumulation in the systems. Combustion is driven by the aridity at the time of the ignition, is how much moisture is available, plant spacing, yeah, I said moisture again, invasive species, a closed or open canopy, and whether or not there has been fire suppression. So some of these things, for example, in areas of southwestern deserts, there have been big increases in invasive grasses that take a system that used to be relatively discontinuous in terms of its canopy and turn it into one that has relatively continuous fuel. And so fires have been increasing in that area. The combustion products are things like char, ash, of course, CO2. Complete combustion results in all of the carbon going off as CO2, but there's a lot of incomplete combustion depending on various factors in these catchments where this occurs. And this is a model we're sort of working on. I'm not sure that I agree with it entirely, so we're still working on it. But the idea is that along this aridity gradient from mesic to arid, you have a zone where the system is primarily flammability limited. That is, there's too much water for the system to catch fire. And on average, on a decadal scale, that could vary from year to year, so it could get smaller. But then over on the arid side, the system is primarily fuel limited. Again, that can be influenced by invasives, by various other things, and it can vary on daily, seasonal, and decadal scales, as I've described for flow. So the third is transport. So when you have this material that's been combusted and is available in is now in the catchment, as you see in this photograph here, it can be transported by wind or water to receiving systems. We're primarily focused on water, and because rainfall and runoff events are extremely episodic in this region, we basically, the amount of transport it can take, it can happen right away, or it could take months or even years before that material is actually transported. And during that time, you could have more accumulation or transformation processes occurring so that the material available to be transported could be changed. There's also wind and other kinds of upland redistribution. And then finally, propagation, which is an interesting idea that we're still kind of working on, but the idea is that after materials are transported to a new undisturbed system, that can alter the accumulation, transformation, and transport processes in that new system. So in streams, for example, you could get ash deposits that stimulate primary production, or they could stimulate bacterial biomass accumulation, or various other things. They could also result in a variety of effects that are not simply a matter of moving material from one place to another, but actually initiating a chain of different events in that cycle. So there have been a few arid land fire papers that have come out, and this one in particular was interesting to me. This was the Las Conchas fire in New Mexico. It was in 2011 was the largest fire ever recorded in New Mexico until 2013, when the next big fire happened and it was larger. But Dom et al. Had sensors in the river below where this fire occurred, and they were able to show, you can see in this oxygen plot here, these oxygen sags sometimes down to 0 oxygen, hypoxic or anoxic conditions in the river. And those resulted in having to close off the intakes for water supply for the city of Albuquerque. So they're really substantial. Dom proposed 2 mechanisms for those sags. One could be a chemical oxygen demand, and the second, a biological process, such as the utilization of DOC, dissolved organic carbon, and particulate organic carbon that come into the system via transport. So we were interested in looking at that. The bushfire occurred in the Sycamore Creek watershed, which is this watershed I've been studying for 45 years. And it was the 5th largest fire in Arizona history. It burned from low desert to ridgetops up into the pine and spruce forests. Because these desert streams are really disconnected from their upland parts of their catchments, except during storms that produce runoff, we anticipated that the effects of this wildfire would only be felt when you had rainfall runoff events occurring. And the stream itself was not burned. So as the upland, half of the watershed was burned. And here's a map that you can see. Here's the watershed. Here is the extent of that bushfire. And it did not burn into the stream, and it only burned these catchments that are on the eastern side of the stream. So we were interested in understanding what the amounts and lability of organic carbon transported from the burned uplands to the stream would be, how long those fire impacts on stream water chemistry could persist, and then whether the oxygen sags that Dom et al. Observed would be observed after desert fire. So we installed equipment. We got a rapid grant rapidly in like 3 weeks. It was amazing. We bought equipment, hired a technician, installed the equipment in 2 unburned sites and 4 burned sites. Here's some of the equipment. This ISCO sampler here is about 10 feet off the ground. It's bolted into that bedrock, and we lost it in one of the floods. Yeah. You're laughing because you know this story. Yeah, and we also included some sondes, some nitrogen sonde, a SUNA, as well as sondes that measure dissolved oxygen and so forth. And unfortunately, we lost some of that equipment in the large floods in 2021 before we were able to sample them. So here's what happens. I told you that these flows are episodic. We got the grant. Here's the burn. We got the proposal submitted. We got the grant in 3 weeks. We got the equipment installed, but it was not until after these floods had occurred in 2020. So we actually were able to get some grab samples from those floods, but we didn't have our equipment installed. I said, no problem. We'll wait till the winter flows. Great. And so here's the winter flows, right? None, 0. So one of those years when you have 0 flows in the winter, no rain, no flows. And then we got hit big in the second year, but I actually had to ask for more money from the NSF to pay my technician for a second year because it was a 1-year grant. All right. So here's what they looked like. This highly colored water and thick ash deposits came in those 2020 floods. Here's a ash deposit. It's what it looked like on the system. The system is usually super clear. Here it's really brown. And that ash is really high in organic carbon. So in 2020, we got these really high organic carbon concentrations, 120 milligrams per liter. The pre-flood, pre-fire max is here, pre-fire 90% is here. But look at, we see that it starts to drop down as we go through these floods in the subsequent years. In 2021, we had mixing with flow from unburned sites, as well as flushing of the organic carbon that was in the system and potentially upland processing between the years. The total dissolved nitrogen, which is a component of dissolved organic nitrogen, is also similar in its pattern, very high concentrations in 2020, lower maximum concentrations in 2021. Oops, sorry. So these are 2 plots from some of our samplers showing the DOC concentration in burned catchment the first time that it flowed, so it gets up to 50 milligrams per liter. And this is one of the unburned catchments here, getting up to about 10 in its first flush. So we wanted to know why those variations from one flood to the other in concentration. One of the things that Mike Bogan did was to put these very clever little sticks out in the stream. They measure conductivity and they're modified so that you can actually detect flow in the system, and you can put them in a low spot and then a little higher and get some sense of how high the flow is. And this movie that you'll see shows for different times which ones of the catchments were turned on, red is flooding, and which ones were off. So you can see it's quite variable because these were summer flows, and summer storms tend to be convective storms that are really localized. So we see that in July 25th of this first of 2021, we get this first flush from a stream that has never flooded before, very high concentrations, low thereafter. This is the one I showed you before. It's the first flush in that system, and then lower systems here. So this is a picture of what you actually see. So this is the upland catchment, which is carrying both burned and unburned material from the watershed. And this is the burned catchment joining that system. So you can see the real difference in concentration there. I asked about oxidant sags, and I only have a few more minutes, right? We weren't able to get any from our equipment that we lost, but we did get this from the Neon site, which is located there. It looks like there are maybe some oxygen sags, but we don't know if those are related to biological processing. But we went ahead and measured lability of this material. We basically collected the material and then incubated it with stream water to see how much of it was consumed over a 3-week period. And so you can see that surprisingly high rates of removal, up to 60%, occurred. And they're, of course, associated with the amount of organic carbon that was in the system. So more organic carbon, higher lability. But there's a tremendous amount of variability in the lability of both, usability of both dissolved organic carbon and total organic carbon. So this is something we're still working on. So preliminary conclusions of this disturbance are that massive amounts of material are indeed transported from burned uplands to the stream. And this disturbance actually can propagate in the system. Some of the material is labile and could be potentially used by microorganisms in the system and explain oxygen sags if they occur. But the propagation of fire effects really varies depending on the hydrologic regime. And so as you saw, a lot of this material that was burned sat in the upland for a year before anything happened and before it moved. And so we don't know to what extent that's been processed and to what extent it's moving through the system. But thank you for your attention.
Are there a couple quick questions?
Food.
Nice talk, Nancy. I'm just wondering how much of that chromophoric DOM is from sort of the surface litter, or do you think some of that's coming up from older material that's stored down in the sediment bed?
I think it's coming from the uplands. I don't
Okay.
think it's stored in the sediments because
No.
the sediments are very low in organic carbon. They tend to be less than 1%.
Okay.
So yeah, I think it's coming from the uplands and probably overland material that's accumulated on the soil surface.
Thanks.
Mhm.
Hello.
Hi.
Do you expect to see changes in the historic stream path due to the fire and dry events?
Is it the historic stream path?
Like where the stream is and where it's been? Are you seeing? Yeah.
Oh yeah,
changes
it
to the-
changes all the time from floods primarily. Because a lot of that sediment gets moved around. And so if it deposits in one place, high flow geomorphologists, they know about this, but it might move from one side of the channel to the other side of the channel associated with floods. With fire, there could be a propagation effect whereby some of this ash can actually block the movement of water into the subsurface. So that would be an effect on flow patterns. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's take Nancy again.
Go get your food. Okay.